Vin Future Prize, a new global science and technology prize for humanity from Vietnam. One Vin Future grand prize of $3 million. Three additional special Vin Future prizes valued at $500,000 each. Vin Future Prize honors science and technology work that creates or has a high potential to create meaningful change in the everyday lives of millions of people. Join us to make a change for a better future.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and our beloved scientists, and welcome back to another Vin Future Innovatalk. Again, I'm Ming Chiang, and I'm the Communication and Marketing Senior Manager of the Vin Future Foundation. And today we are going to focus on the story of three very critical factors of the socio-economic development of any country, which is water, food, and energy, and their reciprocal relationship with climate change. And welcome to the fourth webinar with this topic, Sustainable Irrigation, a perspective on the energy, climate, and food nexus. And now we are very delighted today to have the presence of leading scientists in this field who are always passionately concerned about the environmental sustainability topic. Let us welcome to today's webinar, our chair of today's webinar, Professor Dan Carmen, James and Catherine Law, Distinguished Professor of Sustainability at the University of California, Berkeley. And let us welcome the special speaker of today's webinar, Professor Jennifer Burney Marshall Saunders, Chancellor's Endowed Chair in the Global Climate Policy and Research, School of Global Policy and Strategy, University of California, San Diego. Welcome, Professor, to our today's webinar. And hello, I would like to say hello to Professor Dan Carmen. We really want to share that he's really super busy all the time. He's on the way. And as far as I know, today you are in the airport, right?
It's true. I must admit.
Hello, Professor Dan Carmen.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, and how are you?
I'm doing very well. I hope you can hear me as well.
Yeah, we can hear you now. And we would like to say thank you so much because you are so busy, but you always give us support in everything, the scientific articles and then the webinar, everything. And today you are also here in the webinar with us and our special speaker. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. In fact, I really appreciate everything that the Vin Future Prize is doing, not only to promote the prize, to highlight innovations that affect and benefit everyone, but really to bring unique speakers like you're going to hear tonight from Professor Jen Burney. And Jen is exactly the kind of person that I am hoping we can really find ways to support and learn from as we think about sustainability. Her undergraduate, her first degree was in history and science from Harvard University. And I got to know her when she was finishing her PhD in physics, like I did. Hers was at Stanford University. And I was impressed from the beginning. And I think that you, the audience, will get a real sample of that today. Jen was already doing what we consider cutting edge physics at the time I met her, but she indicated that she was looking to apply both her technical skills and her passion for sustainability and for human betterment to the broad and not always well-defined field of sustainable development, sustainable values. You can see she's done exceedingly well. She's the Marshall Saunders Chancellor's Professor, an endowed professorship at University of San Diego. She, interestingly, is not based in a pure science department. As a scientist, she is based in the Global School of Policy. And I think from one physicist to another, I really appreciate us making inroads into these alien worlds. But I think you'll hear today why I was so excited that she was willing to give this talk, because the mixture of doing basic science, applying data science, applying remote sensing, applying atmospheric chemistry, all of the things that we normally know in the field of climate science. She's combined this with really exciting efforts around human health, indoor air quality, bringing technology to irrigation, bringing the kind of innovations that I suspect we at the Vin Future Prize will be looking at her later on as a potential laureate, because it's this kind of back and forth between the more traditional sciences and what we need to do to apply this to problems in the real world, something I often call mundane science, or bringing high science to critical everyday questions that academics sometimes skip over. It's my hope that you'll share my excitement about the kind of work she's doing, and you'll see the degree to which this is really a 21st century scholar, someone who knows the traditions but is moving far beyond them. So I just want to thank you, Jen, for your commitment to this kind of science, for diversity in the kind of work you do, and for really carving a path for other scientists who want to bring their expertise to areas that might not get the attention that they need if we're going to make the planet habitable and a more just economy and environment for all. So thank you and the Vin Prize so much for being here tonight, this morning.
Presentation of Professor Jen Burney. But first, we really want to listen to your feeling right now. Hello, Professor Jen Burney, and how do you feel right now before we start the presentation and also the webinars?
Hi, everyone. First of all, good morning to everyone in Vietnam. Good afternoon, good evening to those of you joining elsewhere. And thanks for having me, to the entire Vin Future Prize team. It's really exciting what you're doing. And Dan, thank you for that really kind introduction. It's really wonderful to have you as part of this community, and really it's laying the roadmap for what those of us from all sorts of disciplines might be able to do. Thank you all for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Looking forward to this.
Consent as the presentation of Professor Jen Burney of today's webinar. We are going to take a look at an introduction video that we have prepared for all of you about the topic of today. And then our chair, Professor Dan Cameron, will share a little bit about the focus of the talk, and then will be the presentation of the special speaker, Professor Jen Burney. Video, please.
Climate change is fueling the hunger crisis, threatening livelihood, expanding global inequalities, and undermining the sustainable development of mankind. Soil tillage, crop and livestock transportation, manure management, and all the other aspects of global food production generate greenhouse gas emissions to the tune of more than 17 billion metric tons per year, according to a new study published in 2021 of Nature Food. Vice versa, as climate change increases the frequency and ferocity of extreme weather events, it also has a heavy impact on global agriculture and food production. The result includes rising rates of food insecurity and malnutrition. Basically, as the globe warms, the food production to sustain humans' life can be disrupted in many regions. In this episode, we are going to have a conversation surrounding the reciprocal relationship between climate, water, food, and energy. Understanding how food production and consumption contribute to climate change, quantifying the effects of climate change on land use, food systems, human health, can help us design and evaluate technologies and strategies for adaptation and mitigation of negative impacts among the world's farmers. The webinar will be chaired by Professor Dan Cameron James and Catherine Lau, Distinguished Professor of Sustainability at the University of California, Berkeley, with parallel appointments in the Energy and Resources, the Goldman School of Public Policy. He is also a new member of the Vin Future Prize Council 2022. As our speaker, Professor Jennifer Burney, Marshall Saunders Chancellor's Endowed Chair in Global Climate Policy and Research, School of Global Policy and Strategy, University of California, San Diego, will share with us more about the effects of the changing climate patterns on food availability.
Climate change is making it harder to grow enough food, and the way that we produce and consume food is a major contributor to climate change. So we have to solve the two problems not only on their own, but also together. We're very vulnerable to these rainfall extremes. When we think about solutions, though, being able to manage water at the farm level and sort of more systemically is a really promising avenue to create a more food secure world. I'm optimistic, and part of the reason I'm optimistic is because we've learned how valuable adaptation at the farm level can be, and in particular, how effective water management and irrigation, when it's done effectively and sustainably, can be.
The next VinFuture Innovatalk, coming soon on September 23rd, 2022, 9 a.m. Vietnam time, which corresponds to September 22 at 7 p.m. in California.
Well, as I said before, I'd like to thank the Vin Prize Foundation, and I'd like to particularly thank our speaker, Professor Jen Burney, for sharing her work with us. And I just want to kind of highlight why I think that the sort of work that Jen does is not only so important, but it's so easy for scholars at leading universities not to spend the time to develop the tools and to dig in onto the key problems that face emerging communities around the world. Again, today you'll hear about a really unique partnering of on the ground, what we call in English kind of boots in the soil approaches to how irrigation works, doesn't work, and how it can work better. But you'll also hear how it's not enough to be a dedicated and passionate researcher on these key topics. If you don't bring the tools of science, if you don't bring the approach to methodologies from civil engineering and economics, the study and the practice of social justice, you're leaving something out. You're leaving out the ability to translate what we're learning at the forefront of science, STEM fields, from the humanities, from the social sciences, applied to problems that have been treated as in a very practical way for years, decades, or centuries, but not always an area that gets the bright light shined on it of not only how can we make it more energy or water or human labor efficient, but can we look more deeply and observe underlying social patterns that might discriminate against women or children or old people or ethnic minorities that frequently we take for granted. And there's many fields where this kind of thing takes place. When we look at the health impacts of cooking or the impacts of mining for rare earths around the planet, we consistently see that the disenfranchised, ethnic minorities, often child labor, women's time are never valued. And yet this is critical if we are going to change our approach to not only how we treat the planet, but how we treat each other. And so from my perspective, as you listen to Jen's talk, I hope that you'll try to keep two things in mind together. One of which is how exciting is the science she's doing, but the other part is how much is our ability to treat problems of social, racial, environmental inequality with the same attention that we treat projects that kind of get the big attention, the Nobel Prizes, efforts to give out Fields medals, efforts to reward with academy memberships. I actually believe that this kind of work is exactly where we can make the biggest social progress, but it takes unique researchers with the mixture of skills that Jen has applied to problem after problem to treat these problems and to treat the people who they benefit with the kind of respect that, quite frankly, they don't always get as we rush for bigger prizes, shinier technologies. This is really the sweet spot of what we used to call appropriate technology, which, as I mentioned before, I often call the mundane science of a sustainable world. And it's really where I think that the direction that the Vin Future Prize is taking is so exciting, because it recognizes there are exciting in the lab advances that are quite critical. But this whole approach to valuing the world we live in and understanding the world and the people in it where they are, not where we might like them to be in a laboratory, is a rare skill. And so you're all in for a huge treat tonight. Again, I want to thank Jen and the committee, and in particular, our audience. Thank you all for being here, and enjoy the beautiful work that Jen is doing.
Thank you, Dan. I'll go ahead and get my presentation up for all to see. Is that looking okay? All right, thank you. Well, I'm really excited to take a brief tour through this idea of sustainable irrigation and really sustainable water management as a key technology or key suite of technologies that I think has a real important role to play in solving the food security and climate conundrum. And the introductory video did a really nice job of laying out how climate and food security are really deeply intertwined, but I want to walk through it in a bit more detail to place irrigation in that system. So if we think about the way in which we grow food, where we grow it, what we decide to grow, how we manage those production processes, those decisions all result in a suite of emissions into the atmosphere. And those emissions include a lot of long-lived greenhouse gases, but also pollutants. And the way that we're growing food is a major forcer of climate change right now. In turn, those changes in climate are in fact making it more difficult for us to grow enough food, both on land and I will say in the ocean. We're going to focus on land here, but the ocean as a food source is also being profoundly affected by human emissions. And what's really concerning, I think, from a human welfare perspective is that how and when and in what ways farmers or farm systems adapt to those changing conditions and to those climate pressures has the potential to create a vicious loop feedback cycle. For example, if we adapt to climate pressures by cutting down a lot of tropical forests to create more cropland, that's going to be a huge additional burden on climate. And so the question here is really, how do we avoid this kind of vicious cycle? And I want to focus in here on adaptation and the role that irrigation can play, because that's really one point in this system where we could break this and avoid a kind of detrimental feedback cycle. And I want to zoom in on water management and irrigation because this is a set of technologies that really solves a specific set of constraints faced by farmers around the world, right? And this is something very intuitive to everyone on the planet, right? Which is that farmers are exposed to the weather. Farmers are exposed to the seasonal dynamics of the climate, and that's a major constraint on what they're able to do. If we think about the world food economy, it's about 600 million farms. And about 500 million of those are actually family farms, so considered smallholders by whatever their national definition is. So a very large percentage of these are technically smallholders, and they're producing typically in very defined seasons. This is actually from the Sahel in West Africa, a cropping calendar, but a lot of the world looks like this, where there's a principal growing season or maybe a secondary growing season, but farmers and production are really subject to the seasonal cycles of the weather. And what that does is really on a yearly basis, it means that farmers are very much exposed to precipitation extremes, so droughts or floods, but also temperature extremes. However, in addition to being sort of an annual problem, the seasonal nature of production really means that there's also a seasonal cycle to poverty and need and to malnutrition in a lot of these places, right? Many people will be familiar with the term the hungry season or the lean season. right? Sort of after the harvest comes in, farmers are able to sell their crops, they have plenty to eat. But as the year goes along, those stores and that income often dwindles and creates a very, very deep need as farmers wait for the next harvest to come in. And that creates a really detrimental set of dynamics because in many of these areas, as there's a strong need to sell crops at the harvest time, everyone in the region might be feeling the same way. And so often there are local price gluts and farmers are in the unenviable position of selling food at low prices and then in the lean season, having to maybe buy food at high prices. And that creates disincentives. Ultimately, it creates barriers to investments in productivity that would help farmers sort of escape this trap produced by this seasonal cycle. Now, there are many ways out of this, right? And great minds all over the world are thinking about and testing and experimenting with solutions to sort of find ways out of this trap. Improved technology can help, thinking about storage and ability to sort of arbitrage prices. Those are all really great potential solutions to this. We're going to dive into irrigation here, and I want to highlight the role of some different types of technology for irrigation and water management that have been shown in a few different contexts to help break this seasonal cycle and some of the pressures it exerts on both farmers and the climate. And I want to highlight some things that we've learned, I think, about really how to keep irrigation sustainable. So this is a funny diagram, but it's a diagram that captures kind of how I think about irrigation. Irrigation technologies or water management technologies in general are really kind of a bundle of a few different technologies. You need to be able to access water, you need to be able to store it and distribute it, and you have to be able to have some productive use for it. Otherwise, the technology is not going to be worth it. So that bundle of technologies can look a bunch of different ways. And those different technologies can lead to better labor returns, cost savings, better land returns. And those can really drive this cycle of development, increasing investments and returns if sort of implemented in an appropriate way. Around the world, one thing we've seen is that oftentimes irrigation technologies have not been as successful as hoped or have been abandoned, in part because water access really is deeply tied to energy. And a lot of projects historically have assumed sort of human labor would provide that energy. Think about people drawing water from wells or transporting water with jerry cans, et cetera. But systems that have really thought about this energy-water connection have been much more successful. So I'll talk about one of them here. We've had a long-running project in Benin in West Africa that uses solar photovoltaic energy as the source for water pumping for smallholder irrigation systems. It's really quite a conceptually simple system. Here, the solar array powers the pump. The pump pulls water from a surface or groundwater source and fills a cement reservoir, concrete reservoir that just can then passively distribute water through a low pressure irrigation system. We piloted this system in Benin, and it really highlighted the role that energy, and particularly sort of smart energy and water design, can play. Photovoltaics and water management or irrigation are a really nice match. If we think about a typical pump, the power of the pump is usually split. You can imagine this yellow line being kind of a traditional pump curve. And the energy from the pump, the power from the pump is divided between two things, sort of how much the volume and the speed at which water can be pumped, and sort of the amount of gravity and the height it has to be lifted. So sort of how high it has to be moved and how much you can pump. A solar pump, instead of having one curve, really you can think about as operating in this space between high power days when there's a lot of sun and low power days when there's not a lot of sun. The nice thing is that this really well matches crop water needs, which are also driven by how sunny it is outside. So you can design these systems to be kind of passively self-regulating and much more low cost than solar systems that would require inverters or other expensive and really finicky technology. So you can design these to be, well matched such that you get lots of water when you need it, less water when you don't need it on either sunny or not sunny days respectively. And we did this across a range of villages in West Africa and Benin. Here's some pictures of what these components look like. So there's the array. That reservoir is the reservoir that the water is pumped to. It's about 4 meters high. I should have put a person in there for scale. And then these are what some of these irrigated fields look like. We implemented this project with existing women's farming groups who were engaged in hand-watered horticulture. This really enabled them to scale up their production and to professionalize their production and to be able to market it. Here's a little zoom in on Benin where this was done, and we rolled this out in a few phases. And we really took care to measure the impacts by looking at households who were benefiting from this technology and households that were not part of these groups using this technology in the same village. And then also looking at comparison villages where women were still in these groups using hand watering and sort of manual power techniques to produce these horticulture crops. And so with this evaluation framework, we learned that families who used these technologies, this solar irrigation systems, they had improved income or consumption expenditure. Their food security and diet diversity improved. They had reduced anemia. They had increased empowerment in their households, more power over decision-making with family resources. They invested in their kids' education. They accumulated assets. They and their children had improved nutritional status by all sorts of biomarkers. So this is really a technology that created a lot of positive impacts in many different dimensions. And this was in part because, some households sold a lot of the food. Some were really deeply food insecure and consumed a lot of the food. It really was able to provide benefits across a range of needs among the users. Few other pictures. The impact's not always easy to capture, right? So we knew that, for example, these groups were feeding, they started feeding the local schools. So harvesting some of their goods and not consuming it themselves, not selling it, but actually provisioning the local schools to provide meals for the children there. That's not easy to capture in an evaluation strategy, but we learned it was happening. There was also a spillover demand for other solar and water related services. So here's a rehabilitated bore well that these groups sort of funded the provisioning of this equipment to just create better drinking water access. So instead of a manual or a foot pump, now you've got a solar pump filling a little reservoir. And I love this design element here where the spigot is actually at standing height. So women can, who traditionally are carrying these basins on their head, can just walk right up to the spigot. It gets turned on and off they go. So these kinds of spillovers have taken place across the region and are scaling up through some other mechanisms of funding. We'll shift around the world a little bit to another semi-arid region, thinking about Northeast Brazil. And this area is really emblematic of, like Benin, like the Sahel, one of the most sort of intense climate signals. So precipitation decline in the past few decades has been quite substantial. It's moved from a sort of semi-humid to semi-arid. Temperature increase is higher than most places, as is the case across these semi-arid regions. And this is a livestock area. This is an area that's produces a lot of dairy and meat products, but again, is really built around smallholder systems. And a lot of those systems have been strained by these climate changes over the years. So this is a little smallholder farm. You can see the fence delineating it, and you can see that the land is, completely stripped bare, compacted. This is very degraded farmland. This puts a lot of pressure on farmers, right? That they are at risk really of, losing both their income and their assets if they can't keep their animals alive. But if they aren't able to feed them off their land base, this is a really profound exposure. So as you can see, there's water, but how could we think about management, of these farm systems such that we could enable farmers to make it through dry seasons and make it through difficult periods of drought, for example, without totally degrading their land? So a bunch of organizations in Brazil have been working to develop novel feeds for smallholder livestock owners. And one of them is opuntia, a cactus that is common across the region where I am calling in from. We like to eat it in tacos, but it turns out it's a very good livestock feed as well. And it's an effective water management strategy, if you will. This plant holds a lot of water and can be stored for long periods of time, enabling farmers to grow and store feed without needing their animals to graze, land and compact it and sort of run into this degradation cycle. So this has been very effective, and we've got a lot of happy cows and a lot of new plantations of this feed cropping up really all over Brazil. And this has had some interesting effects, including allowing smallholders in this region to better comply with Brazil's forest code, which insists that they keep a fraction of their land in native habitat. So again, all sorts of spillover effects. A key question, though, is, if it's true that irrigation and water management are incredibly powerful for smallholder farmers, how do we really ensure that it's done sustainably, right? Because another fact that I think everyone in the world is familiar with is that in most big irrigating regions around the world, irrigation has not sort of stayed within sustainable bounds. So here I'm actually showing you a photo and a plot from near me in California in our Central Valley. It's our main agricultural region, and across the valley, the surface of the earth has sunk many feet over the past few decades because so much water has been pumped out of the aquifer underneath the surface. And this is the case for many big irrigating regions across the world, that the amount of stored water indicated here in major basins has declined over time. Too much is being withdrawn compared to what is sustainably recharged each year. So one thing we've been working on, and an additional type of technology that I think is going to play a really important role in this nexus, is to use satellites to understand more about who's irrigating how much, and whether or not irrigation is happening sustainably as it scales up over regions. So I'll just offer a few examples. One type of satellite remote sensing technology looks at reflectances from the surface, and those can be analyzed to give a very good signal of the type of vegetation that is growing and what sorts of dynamics it's experiencing. So the This is a sheer function of the biology of plants. Plants absorb different wavelengths of light depending on both how much chlorophyll they have and their water content. And so by observing the surface of the earth, we can see whether crops are growing and being harvested and what the dynamics look like. We've looked at this in a bunch of different locations across the world, but what we've learned is that you can really detect when irrigation has been implemented and what that's doing to crop productivity. And this is important from sort of a larger scale policy monitoring perspective. So I'm showing you a zoom in here from the Netherlands, and here's 4 little points being monitored across these fields. And you can see that in one season, 1 year, excuse me, there's 1 growing season at one of these points, and in the next year, in the previous year, it was sort of a much longer season. So this looks like something that was being irrigated that then got moved to 1 cycle, so irrigation not being used. Down here, conversely, we can see something with predominantly 1 season in 1 year moving to biseasonal production in the following year. And so by matching these signals with information about precipitation, we can really infer when additional water is being used at really high resolution, but also over large spatial scales. And that lets us think really about sustainable limits in a way that we haven't been able to. One final role for satellite monitoring technology has been to directly observe motion of the surface of the Earth. By using radar, interferometric radar observations, we can look at, for example, regions like California's Central Valley, where I mentioned the surface of the Earth has subsided several feet due to overdraft of groundwater. Well, now we can see very fine scale surface motion over over daily to weekly time periods across really large regions with some of these satellites. And that's taught us all sorts of interesting science about how water moves and recharges as the land surface goes up and down, but also has really helped reveal where and when overpumping is happening. And that's the kind of technology that really will be critical in conjunction with interventions with smallholder farmers to help manage water to make sure that we're, simultaneously doing as much as we can to help smallholders flourish while also not tipping into unsustainable overdraft of water at larger scales. We have looked at this in California. This is a zoom in map of our Central Valley here, where the different colors are different crops. And this is this very fertile Central Valley. We call it, the salad bowl or the fruit bowl of the state. And we've shown that with this type of monitoring, we can really see how much water different crops are using and where, and can infer a little bit about management practices from a remote perspective. And this is, we hope, going to be helpful in designing sustainable groundwater policy in our state. I will stop there and thank you for letting me take this tour with you through a range of technologies that are sitting in this interface between food, energy, and water, and in particular thinking about water management at the farm level.
Thank you very much, Professor Jennifer Burney, for your very insightful presentation. And a lot of our guests and also audience have shared that they're really interested in the topic and also your presentation today. Thank you once again. And right now, I would like to invite Professor Dan Cameron and Professor Jennifer Burney to start the reflection parts right now before we coming in the most exciting part of today's webinar, which is the Q&A session. And now, please, Professor Dan Cameron.
Well, thank you so much. And Jen, that's exactly what I was hoping we'd hear. It's fascinating to see both the on the ground and the in the sky work, if you will. I wanted to ask you a provocative question, ask you to speculate a little bit, and that is, with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the issues around the wheat harvests, the excessive droughts, the super droughts we've seen in China, in the United States, and Southern Europe, the fact that the world lives with only about 60 days of food in the cupboard, if you will, as a reserve. I'm wondering if some of the measures that we talk about paying big farms for, carbon negative agriculture or water smart farming, I'm wondering if there are ways that we might apply this to these smallholders that would increase the food security for the people who almost always get the short end of the deal, get the raw treatment when there are crises, when food prices go up, when petroleum, when fertilizer goes up, when machinery is not available. These are the people who starve first. And would there be mechanisms that we could reward farmers for self-production, for sustainable mechanisms, for bringing these things like the cactus fence rows to broader communities to not only improve our reliability living in Europe and the US, but really to reward local reliability in ways that we simply don't do today? Or is that reaching too far?
I think it's a great question. I don't think it's provocative. I think it's exactly what we need to do. And really, that's a question of kind of policy innovation, right? So a few examples. We've seen, some endogenous adoption of these kinds of smoothing technologies. So I think folks in the Vietnam audience will appreciate, right, the role that crops like cassava can play in food security. Cassava is great because it breaks this seasonal cycle. It doesn't make a lot of money in local markets, but you can plant it, you can leave it for longer than sort of a standard season, and it can be a really nice smoothing crop for smallholders. So one could imagine some policies to create some very local, almost reserve systems that would be pretty straightforward and don't really involve new technologies, just involve some new organization. I think moving a little bit larger scale, we've seen that some real success with connecting farmers to information and connecting farmers with each other to be able to economize either on input purchases as groups or to be able to bundle their production together, get it graded, get it out to larger markets. And that has helped farmers arbitrage those deep local price signals. And I think that allows farmers to have a bigger cash reserve that is really then important if there is a shock, right, to be able to weather higher prices. So all sorts of different possible technological solutions, but I do think that is exactly the type of innovation that needs to happen.
Excellent. Okay. I do know, I'll just ask one more and then we're going to throw it open to the audience overall. There have been a number of efforts to, for example, take efforts like the Green Revolution and focus them around local farmers. And know in the Philippines, there was the Masapag 99 to really highlight the things that local farmers wanted, certain tastes, ability to deal with saline soils and things. Are there any examples when kind of the West or East Asia really rewarded those, or did these have to go on as kind of guerrilla movements to get these approaches in place and really never seen support? I mean, are there some cases where these practices really did get the attention, the dissemination, the treatment that they deserve by the wider agricultural community?
That's a great question. My sense is that where these have been successful, they have been smaller, and that has limited the reach and the sort of translation of learning, even though contexts might be very different, the sort of organizational learning that might happen with a larger scale project. But we've seen some really interesting efforts around specialty crops in Southeast Asia, in West Africa, in Central Africa. But again, I do think that there is a role for more organized institutional learning region to region, even if the specific solutions and focus points are different crops and different preferences.
Fascinating. Okay, my thanks. I know we need to turn it over for the audience that's been waiting. But my thanks, and I really appreciate the answers as well as the talk itself.
Thank you very much, Professor Dan Kam and also Professor Jen Burney. And right now, I think that it's time for us to move to the Q&A session. And now we have a lot of questions for you from the audience. First, I'm looking at the audience list, and I can see many experts in this field. And that's the thing that we are so happy because we have very high quality audience. And right now, we are very much appreciate the presence of Dr. Lung Quang Hui. Hi, Dr. Quang Hui. Can you hear us?
Morning. Hi. Yeah, I can hear you very well. Thank you.
Hello. And can you share a little bit about your feeling right now after hearing the presentation and also the introduction about you a little bit for our chair and our speakers to know about you? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chang, and well, thank you very much for having me. And well, coming from the a little bit different field that Professor Kamen and Professor Burney are working on. I'm working for the Ministry of Natural Resources Environment, the Department of Climate Change, and we've been working on the policy making on climate change in the past 20 years. And I myself focusing a lot more on the GHG emission reduction aspect of climate change, but my personal research when I did my PhD was actually on adaptation, and so that this is very exciting to join this this seminar with the agriculture and water and energy nexus and with the food security. And so first of all, thank you very much, Professor Burney, for the very insightful presentation and example from different countries. And I think that, well, first of all, those are lessons that Vietnam can look at and also can reflect on what we are doing right now in Vietnam, even those that, well, quite frankly, that, well, we are doing quite well on food security, and especially in the north of Vietnam, in the Red River Delta, where I would say that we would have probably one of the best, if not the best, water management system in the world. But still, with the impacts of climate change, that can change very quickly. And the farmers are probably the most vulnerable to climate change impacts at the moment. And with the IPCC recent research, then Vietnam still remains one of the most vulnerable countries, especially agricultural sector. Secondly, in terms of water management, that, well, because we are the very long countries in terms of the different types of climate areas. And so many areas in our countries are facing droughts, for example, in Central Highland and in some of the provinces in the south of Vietnam. And we're facing water shortage and also the quality of the water as well. And that is something that you've been talking about in different countries. And how to ensure the access to water resources, to sufficient water resources for croppings and for other activity related to food production. And that is questions that we the government trying to answer, and we're struggling with that in the past few years with the impact of climate change. And secondly, that, well, the recent COP26, as we all know, that Vietnam is committing with the net zero target by 2050. And we're having a lot of pressure from international community to reach that. And that is putting a lot of pressure on energy sector in Vietnam at the moment. And currently, that, while we using about 30% of our energy structure from coal, and around another 30% is from water resources, from hydropower, and that is the issue with the agriculture now. in terms of how we manage water resources for the energy production and also for agriculture production, especially in the south of Vietnam, with a lot of the issue that is going on in terms of with the impacts of climate change, the rising temperature, and also other aspects of climate change that the coming waves. So I think that while my questions here may not be that what we can answer right away, but I would like you to share your experience from different countries. Currently Vietnam, that we have different types of crops or different types of agricultural products. So what would be the most striking challenge that we need to deal with in the time of climate change, and what would be the agricultural production models that we should apply in terms to ensure that our not only water security but also food security and energy security in Vietnam. I just hope that you can get the general opinions on that for Vietnam at the moment, because there's many different examples that you've been working on, and I think that the technologies that you show in your presentation can be applied very well in Vietnam in many places, and then that would be great for us to learn from. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to have you here, and I'm very glad that you drew attention to a few points. The first is, of course, as you mentioned, that Vietnam is really at the technological frontier in some ways with water management. And so it's a great place to think about innovation and how to think about managing sort of future risks. The second point that you mentioned, I'd like to add some detail to, and that is that the IPCC did note that Vietnam is one of the most climate exposed regions of the world, and that's not, it's a unique and vast type of exposure, right? Because you're exposed to droughts and typhoons and floods and saltwater intrusion and landslides and land disturbances from extremes. So it really is a very complicated set of potential relationships between water and sort of hydrological extremes in a changing climate and the food production system. And that becomes more complicated when you are facing sort of competing pressure to use water both for energy and for food. We have the same dilemma here in California, where we are increasingly hoping to rely on hydropower as the stable base power, on top of which we'd have a lot of renewables, but at the same time we're having droughts and needing to use more of that water for agriculture as well. So I think just to add a little bit of detail to what you laid out, there really is a sense in which Vietnam is the right place to do this research, to learn, to try a lot of solutions, to learn institutionally, and to really be the place that can learn and pass on a whole range of solutions to other places with some subset of those exposures. Because again, you are exposed to so much, so many different dimensions of climate change. The other thing that is really important is that Vietnam is an important player in the world food economy, right? It's this Vietnamese agricultural production is not just about Vietnamese food security. There are a lot of downstream trading partners that depend on the products produced. And so there really is a sense of climate shocks to Vietnam, not only disrupting domestic welfare and food security and economic production, but also having really important welfare implications for trading partners. And when I think about that, I specifically think about the world rice market, right, which is pretty thin and is sort of the amounts that are traded on the global market are quite are often a lot smaller, I think, than folks would assume, who maybe aren't involved in food security, but are really, really important at the margins for those importing countries. So I don't think I've offered any solutions here, but simply to say that I think Vietnam is really positioned as a place where this type of technological experimentation and learning is going to be extremely valuable, both obviously domestically, but really for the world.
Well, thank you.
Much for your question, Dr. Hui, and we really want to introduce Dr. Quang Huy is a very reputable scientist of Vietnam from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment of Vietnam. Thank you very much again. And right now we can recognize the participation of Dr. Dũng Lê from the Bayer from the Bayer's crop science company, and we really want to have the question from you. Can you hear us, Dr. Dũng Lê?
Yeah, hi, hello, thanks a lot, the MC. Yeah, so hi, thank you, Professor Bernie, and the chair, and I'm Lee, and I work for the agriculture industry, and thanks a lot for your presentation. It was really eyes-opening on what technology can help us deliver sustainable agriculture. I had a few questions for you, probably not just only question, but it also my thought over the past few days or weeks since I received the invitation from the Win Future Prize for your seminar. So I understand that, like, for the water use efficiency or more water efficient irrigation, it could be easily for the people or for the segment where the water access is limited. So there's no other way but have to implement the more efficient water irrigation. But however, we are looking on more general perspective where people had a plentiful access to water, but then we still need to save that water. And what could be the driver to have people have plenty access to water to implement the more water saving irrigation method? So that's one of my thought in since I had that the topic of your presentation. The second part probably is more about how can we this is more about policy oriented. Probably if you can elaborate or if you see some business model, maybe you can share with us, like when we are having one company or one country committed to have more sustainable agriculture, and then they have to invest a lot of money and efforts and resources into having that product produced with more sustainable method. And how can we get that product price more competitive or remain competitive to the product that export from country where they don't actually follow the more sustainable agriculture, and then because they are using low cost or cheap technology, more environment impacted technology, and then in a short term their product price become more look like more competitive. So how can we drive that in more maybe crop country, crop nation policy? Yeah, so I think that my two major point that I would like you to, if you can share with us your maybe observation or something you have seen during your work. Thanks.
Yeah, those are two fantastic points. So I would say this question of how to incentivize water savings, particularly among users who have more water than they need, is a big one. And even in California, where we have a drought right now, our water rights system has created a similar situation where there are users who have first use access rights and don't use all of it and are much more wasteful, for example, than people who are paying for water or having to sort of are downstream in the rights hierarchy. There's been a lot of experimentation in different systems around the world to think about really collective payment systems, right? If that water has a value, what's the way to put a small price on it that incentivizes efficient use and letting water pass further downstream, et cetera. And those types of payments, whether it's for ecosystem services or really for efficient use, have been very effective. And there's some analogs for things like tillage and soil management. For example, in the United States, we have really high rates of no-till agriculture, and it's really largely through conservation payments to farmers that has been widely adopted and quite successful. So I think there's really a role for, sort of payment for ecosystem services models that help farmers feel like they're participating in the collective good through, taking on more efficient practices and having some resources to do that. The second question that you asked is really fantastic because we do see this, right? The trading regime globally is built to reward economic gains from trade, right? Economic efficiencies, and often those come at the expense of environment, particularly if there's no mechanism for putting a price on the negative environmental externalities of the most economically efficient agricultural practices. There are some examples of international agreements that have been very effective. So the two that I'm thinking of are both related to deforestation. So the Amazon moratorium and sort of zero deforestation policies, and similar attempts being made right now with oil palm, sort of sustainable certification, zero deforestation certified products. I think there's a role for something like that when it comes to general environmental efficiency or environmentally friendly practices, right? Sort of sustainably grown rice, sustainably grown mangoes, where we define what that means in the context of a specific crop. And sometimes there's some ecological differences, right? It might mean something different in the Philippines from Vietnam, but to really understand and agree upon some basic principles and to then adopt national standards for what it means and who we'll trade with. And I think that's really the way, is through international norms to sort of bring the rest of the market into compliance. Europe has sort of wielded a heavy hand on this by saying no GMOs or whatever, and different sort of policies like that. But it's been fairly effective in driving that kind of change.
Thank you, Professor Bunny.
Much for the question from Dr. Dũng Lê, and also the answer from Professor Jen. And we have a hand rising from Dr. D.A. Phil Rice. Yeah, can we hear your voice right now?
Hello.
Hello. Yeah.
Good morning. Good morning in the Philippines, actually.
Mabuhay.
Yeah, mabuhay. Yeah, it's not a question actually, but rather I would like to get your opinion on the incentivizing the farmers who are supposed to use water management practices that are adapting to climate change, as well as some mitigation effects. I am talking about the well-known technology on alternate wetting and drying in rice cultivation. And as was mentioned earlier by my colleague who just sent you his thought on incentivizing farmers, I have this thought because we tried to upscale the adoption of AWD in a small a run-of-the-river type or diversion type irrigation canal system, I should say, that has about 7,000 hectares service area. Because of the dwindling flow on the river during the dry season, they can only plant about 5,000 hectares of that. So meaning it's about 1.6 cropping intensity, meaning at the dry season you have lower. But then when we implemented the collective action of adopting the water management technology, AWD, in that area, after 1 year of practicing and teaching the farmers how to go about it, they were able to come up with a 200% cropping intensity. And in the Philippines, most of our irrigation systems are the diversion type or run-of-the-river type irrigation systems. So what I thought of is that of the 1.3 million hectares irrigated, during the dry season, about only 60% of that is planted and where water is available because of the practice of the farmers of continuously flooding. Now, what comes to mind is the farmers would not like to adapt the technology, maybe when we are still there piloting, but when after the project, they revert back to continuously flooding because they said that what is it for them if they adapt? What do good they get? But looking at the adaptation and mitigation aspects brought about by AWD, it is very big because basically in our experiments conducted in the Philippines and maybe in other countries, the mitigation of methane is about 15 tons CO2 equivalent per year. So if you multiply that with that millions of hectares, then we have quite a number or a volume of methane reduction. I was looking, and actually we were looking into how we can get these fundings to implement capacity building for the farmers, because the farmers would only adopt a technology if they see by themselves that it is really working. Okay, so the best thing that we can do is go to the farms, educate the farmers, train them how to do it, so that it will comply with the requirements in the approved methodology under the UNFCCC small scale emission reduction. Okay. So one of my main question is, can you give us or help us find? Of course, there are these offsetters, no, but that is still a big question how to get to them, because currently maybe in the most of the countries in the world doesn't have the regulations or laws regarding internationally transferable mitigation outcomes, or we call it carbon trading. So I don't know, maybe this is quite early too, but we would like to explore how can we go about it and incentivize our farmers who would be willing to adopt the technology, so long as they are given even a small amount of incentive so that they will adapt, because this incentive can be used collectively by the farmer associations or the farmers themselves as an additional cost for farm operations. And the second one is, of course, we would not like to rely solely for rice. We would like the farmers to plant other crops, high value crops at that matter. But then again, our irrigation systems are not suited for that purpose. It's still flooding, but we would like to make some mechanisms that will make water utilization more effective, or the water productivity more effective. So I think that is the most important two questions I have in mind, and I would be very much happy to hear from you and maybe even from the others. Thank you.
Thank you for those great questions. I will take a very quick answer because I think it would be really nice to hear some of the other opinions here. So the first thing I'll say is that AWD is really, a technological innovation that's going to be very important for a really difficult to mitigate source, right? So reducing methane emissions from rice, that's a key piece to a sustainable global future. And, you know, what we've learned from other contexts and other climate, you know, pieces of the climate problem is when we have like a great solution, but really adoption and like long run adoption of the practice or the technology is what's important. Then we need to think about like being creative with institutional design. So there's some really interesting work bringing farmers into designing these programs themselves. So bringing, you know, farmers and extension agents and, you know, even regulators in the context where there might be regulators involved, but to really think about what's feasible, what is the type of incentive that works, what are ways that that members of interlinked, you know, systems can understand collective action problems in a more personal way, because we know that helps adoption, as you said. And really, I guess my point is that this is a moment for experimentation on the policy design side. So how are we experimentation around implementation itself, and trying lots of different approaches and seeing what works and scaling that. So I think it's just a very important piece of the global climate puzzle. So I would encourage that kind of experimentation. Let me pass this. Let me just make sure that I leave room for other folks to comment if they'd like.
Thank you very much, Professor Jennifer Burney, and also our guest, our audience. And there's not much time left, so that we will move real quickly to the next question from Dr. Đặng Minh Hiếu from Vietnam Japan University. Can I hear the question from you, please?
Yes, I hear you clearly. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, but can you turn on the camera, please? Thank you very much.
I can't see the camera. Well, I can't see the button for
Okay,
camera.
it's all right. Yeah, can you share the question with our our guest speaker? Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Đặng Minh Hiếu, and I'm now a lecturer in Smart Agriculture program at Vietnam Japan University, a member university of Vietnam National University, Hanoi. So my research major fall into the field of agricultural environments, where I concern the impacts of pollutant on crops and how to restore water and soil from contamination with agricultural contaminants. Thank you, Professor Burney, for a very interesting talk, and of course, thank VinFuture for organizing this event. Your talk is very interesting and informative. I have two questions for you. My first question is that nowadays many agricultural areas now depends on water from aquifers. So what technologies are currently in use for efficient management and equitable distributions of this water? I had the time in the US where I heard a lot of story between landowner and the government about how the right to access this water and the benefits, the trade-off between that. Yeah, that's my first question. And my second question is about the, I would like to ask your opinion, your views on the use of mini dams to provide electricity for agricultural activity in highlands and mountainous areas in Vietnam, as well as in other countries in Southeast Asia, which share the similar geographical characteristics. Because I know that there is many areas in highlands and mountainous area, they suffer not only on the climate change, but also the low infrastructure for energy. So I'd like to ask your opinion. Yeah, thank you.
Those are great questions. So the first question about groundwater, I think you point to a very important scientific question for the world, right? Which is, how do we move from the way that the world is mostly organized right now, right? Which is, we tend to think of landholders as having, you know, the right to access the sun above their heads and the water beneath their feet, right? And if they're willing to put in equipment and willing to pay the cost to pump that water, there's very little policy or very little in the way of institution that stands in the way of that. So right now, I would say we're in a world where almost nothing exists to guarantee equitable access or, you know, sort of a more globally sustainable use of that resource. So that is a huge area for research, both you know, on the technological side, so things like using satellites and using monitors, but also on the human side to really understand what types of organizations and infrastructures and policies can guarantee or better help ensure equitable access to that resource. Your second question about small dams in highland areas is, I think, a great one, and it's a perfect illustration of how water can provide many different services, right? So water can be used for energy, water can be used for food, water can be used to ensure environmental flows, right? Sustainable protection of fish and wildlife populations in those ecosystems. And you know, my opinion on this is that small dams may be a really effective way of leveraging that resource for communities to develop and have energy access. But I think we really need to consider you know, sort of the full set of ecosystem services provided by water in these contexts. It's very intuitive to most communities, you know, who might make the decision to install or build small dams. So just to think about a really holistic planning and evaluation process that takes into account all the possible uses and all the different downstream effects, so we can make good decisions, you know, sort of as communities, but also as communities linked to other communities by the resources that we share.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And for the last question, we can recognize the presence of Dr. Hồng Quân Nguyễn from the Institute for Circular Economy Development of Vietnam National University, Ho Chi Minh City. And this is the last question of today's webinar. Please, Dr. Quân Nguyễn.
Okay, hello, thank you very much, MC, for introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you so great presentations and really inspiring discussion from all of you. Yeah, I just have actually one question I mentioned earlier in the Q&A, but I want to repeat it. That actually we are working on circular economy, and we found it is quite a great opportunity to work on that, especially to the linking between renewable energy and agriculture. And also we found it's very challenges, especially looking also on the small landholder farmers. And I like very much on the discussion on previously also about how we can apply, you know, advanced technology, for example, IoT, satellite monitoring, or also, for example, digital currency to linkage for smallholder farmers, so that we can support their efforts in sustainable agriculture practice, and also with other like regenerative agricultures or renewable energy development. So yeah, so my question is any really like practice or potentiality that you can see about this opportunity, especially when we look at the Vietnam or Mekong Delta. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll come back to the sentiment that I expressed earlier, which is that Vietnam in the Mekong Delta is exactly the place where we want to be. This is at the forefront, you know, of this set of questions. This is exactly where we want to be experimenting and learning for the benefit both locally, but also for the world. I think there's been a lot of really interesting work inspired by the idea of circular economy to bring precision agriculture to smallholder farmers. And the costs for these technologies, you know, which have typically only been available to, you know, industrialized farms, are really coming way, way down, in part because of proliferation of mobile technology, rapid advances in freely available satellite data, and an innovation that you know, by people who care about these issues, to think about sort of developing you know, precision agriculture platforms for smallholder farmers to be able to really more effectively manage nutrient and input flows. So I am very optimistic by how rapidly that landscape has changed. I think, you know, 10 years ago, we would not be having this conversation of it, you know, it would seem like a sort of crazy dream. And now it feels not that far from possible. And again, I think this is a place where a really robust landscape for experimentation and a willingness to sort of invite innovators to think about this problem and develop solutions and work with stakeholders to see what works and what doesn't work, and to iterate on that is really a promising path forward. I think we're at the right time, and we have what we need to really take on this question. I'm optimistic.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And Professor Jennifer Burney, do you know that today we have a new record that no question read from by the MC, because today it's a great opportunity for all of our audience to take advantage of this chance to ask you directly. So this is the only webinar that we have all the direct question from audience. Thank you so much, all of our audience. And do you want to share the last words with our audience today, Professor Chen?
Well, I would like to say that that's a really big honor. So thank you for everyone for being so engaged and for your really fantastic questions. I'll just reiterate that I think, again, Vietnam's really at the frontier of these interlinked systems, and what we learn in terms of what works both technologically and institutionally in Vietnam is really going to benefit the whole world. So I am delighted that you all asked me to be here. I'm really honored that you asked me to be here, and I hope we can continue these conversations into the future.
Thank you very much. And we have learned a lesson from today that there is not only the effect from climate change to us as a human being, but also the effect from us to the world, to the food production, by our food consumption and our food production, and all of our activities in our everyday lives that affects and impacts our world and our climates. And we hope that all the people, all the audience of today can understand that message and all other insightful information from your presentation. Thank you very much. We know that there's a lot of other questions from the audience, but if you still want to ask our speaker, you can send the question to the email office@vinfutureprize.org. And also, please fill in our online survey that will be provided in this chat box for you so that we can have more information to better improve our next webinar. So right now, thank you a lot. Thanks a lot, our beloved audience, and thanks our chair, Professor Dan Kamen, and special thanks to our special guest, Professor Jennifer Burney, for today, for your time and all of your sharing. Thank you very much once again, and hope to see you very soon. Goodbye. See you again.